Every family has a joke they tell too often. The kind that gets repeated at dinner tables and holiday gatherings, and in the car on long drives until it stops being funny and becomes something else. A habit, a shorthand, a way of saying something that cannot be said directly by saying it sideways, disguised as humor, deniable if challenged. In my family, the joke was me. Specifically, the joke was that I was adopted, that I had arrived in the family by some process other than biology, that the evidence was right there, if you looked. I was quieter than my parents, more serious than my brothers, darker in my coloring in a family of people who sunburned easily and without apology. Where did you even come from, Nadia? My mother, laughing. We found her on the doorstep. My father, also laughing. Nadia's the mailman's, my oldest brother Seth, at Thanksgiving, every Thanksgiving, until I was old enough to tell him where to put that particular observation. It was a joke. Everybody laughed, including me eventually, because laughing was easier than the alternative, and because I had been hearing it since I was 6 years old, and by 12 I had learned to perform the right response on cue. I performed it for 20 years. Then, on a Tuesday evening in March, at the age of 24, I sat across from my parents at the kitchen table and told them I had taken a DNA test. Their faces turned white. Not pale. Not surprised. White, in the specific way of people who have just heard something that they knew someday they would hear and had spent years hoping the day would not be today. The joke stopped being funny in that moment. It also stopped being a joke. My name is Nadia Voss. Before I take you into that kitchen, hit like and subscribe. It means more than I know how to say. Drop your city and your time in the comments. I read every single one. Let me start at the beginning. The real one, which turned out to be different from the one I thought I had. Part 1. The joke: my family was 5 people. My parents, Frank and Linda Voss. My brother, Seth, who is 4 years older than me, and Tommy, who is 2 years older. And me, the youngest, the only girl, the punchline of the adoption joke since approximately the year I was old enough to understand what adoption meant. We lived in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, in a house with a basketball hoop in the driveway that nobody had moved in 15 years, despite the fact that none of us played basketball anymore, which is a very specific kind of family artifact that says something about the difficulty of change when change requires acknowledging that time has passed. My family was not a bad family. I want to say this clearly and mean it, because the story I'm about to tell could be mistaken for the story of a bad family, and it isn't. They were a loud family. A family that communicated through jokes rather than through direct statements, through teasing rather than through tenderness, through the presence of laughter rather than the expression of feeling, because expressing feelings was considered in the Voss household a form of unnecessary vulnerability that left you open to being teased about it later. The adoption joke lived comfortably in this environment. It had all the right qualities. It was funny. It had a target. It was repeatable. And it never required anyone to mean what they were saying, because it was just a joke. And everybody knew it was just a joke. So if the target of the joke occasionally had a face that went quiet for a moment before the laugh appeared, nobody had to address that, because the joke had protected itself with the word just. It's just a joke. It's not serious. Don't be dramatic, Nadia. Here is the thing about jokes that contain a grain of truth. The grain does not dissolve. It sits in the middle of the humor and it waits. It waits for the right conditions to become visible. It waits for the right question to be asked. It waits for the right person to take it seriously, just once, just for a moment, and see what happens to the room when they do. I took it seriously on a Tuesday evening in March. The room happened. Part 2. Why I was different. I want to be fair about something. The joke had a foundation. Not a large one, not a definitive one, but something. I was different from my family in ways that were visible from the outside. My parents were blonde in the way of Midwestern people who have been blonde for generations, fading now to the distinguished gray of people who once were blonde. Seth was blonde. Tommy was blonde and freckled and turned the color of a stop sign in July. I was dark-haired, olive-complexioned, the kind of person who tanned rather than burned, who had a bone structure that did not quite match the rounded, open-faced structure of the people I ate dinner with every night. Beyond appearance, I was quieter, more interior. I read more than the rest of my family combined. I had opinions I kept to myself unless directly asked, and sometimes even then. I approached problems differently, more slowly, more from the inside, more interested in understanding the why of a thing than in solving it and moving on. My mother called this overthinking. My brothers called it being weird. My father, on his better days, called it being thorough. None of these differences are evidence of anything. Families produce outliers. Genetics is a complicated lottery. Kids come out different from their parents for 100 boring biological reasons that have nothing to do with the mailman or a doorstep. But the joke had attached itself to the differences and made them mean something, and meaning, once attached, is not easy to detach. By the time I was 12, the joke and the differences had become fused in my mind into something that felt like a question I was never supposed to ask directly. I didn't ask it directly. I filed it. I lived around it. I grew up in that house and left for college and built a life in a city 2 hours from Cleveland, and called home on Sundays and came back for holidays and accepted my role as the punchline of the joke with a practiced ease that I had developed over 20 years and that nobody looked at closely enough to see was practiced. I was 23 when I thought about taking a DNA test for the first time. I was 24 when I actually took one. The decision was not dramatic. That is what I want you to understand about it. It was not the result of a fight or a revelation or a bad Christmas. It was the result of a Tuesday evening, alone in my apartment, and a social media advertisement for a consumer genetics company. And the thought that arrived quietly and without fanfare. I could just know. Whatever there is to know, I could just know it. I ordered the kit. I waited 4 weeks for results. I opened the email on a Wednesday morning before work. I sat with what it said for 3 days before I drove to Cleveland. Part 3. What the test said. I am going to tell you what the results said carefully and in the right order, because the order matters. The ethnicity breakdown was first. It was not a match for the Voss family profile in ways that were meaningful, not impossible to explain through the ordinary scramble of genetics, but notable. I had already known I looked different. Now I had a number attached to the difference. That alone was not the thing that made me drive to Cleveland. The thing that made me drive to Cleveland was the relative matching. Consumer DNA tests, if enough people have taken them, can identify biological relatives. The system is not perfect. It is not a court document. But it is, when a match appears, a piece of information that has the weight of a question that cannot be untaken. I had a match. Not a distant cousin. Not a third-generation relative with a tenuous connection. A close match. The system's estimate for the relationship category was specific. The algorithm that categorizes these things had looked at the shared DNA and produced a label. The label said, close family, likely parent or sibling. The name attached to the match was not Frank Voss. It was not Linda Voss. It was not Seth or Tommy. The name was a woman I had never heard of. An account that had been created 2 years earlier and had a first name and a last initial and no photograph and no family tree and nothing else, as if someone had taken the test and uploaded the results and then waited. Her name was Elena C. I sat with the test results for 3 days. I thought about what they meant. I thought about what they might mean. I thought about alternative explanations, about the imprecision of algorithms, about the stranger things that genetics has produced. I am a person who approaches problems from the inside. I thought about it from the inside. At the end of 3 days, I had not found an alternative explanation that satisfied me. I drove to Cleveland on a Tuesday. Part 4. The kitchen table. My parents were home. This was not an accident. I had called ahead, said I was coming for dinner, brought pasta from a place in my city that my mother liked. A Tuesday evening. A normal thing. A daughter visiting, bringing pasta, sitting at the kitchen table that had sat in the same spot for 25 years. We ate. My father talked about a project at work. My mother talked about a neighbor. I listened and responded and ate my pasta and waited. I had thought about when and how to say the thing I had driven 2 hours to say. I had rehearsed several versions of it. I had rejected all of them because they were too careful, too framed, too clearly the result of someone who had been preparing, and I needed to see the unguarded response. So after dinner, when the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured and my parents were settled in the way of people who have eaten and are comfortable, I said it the way I had said it when I was 12 and 20, and every age between, casually, lightly, with the cadence of something that had always been said casually and lightly in this house. I said, "Hey, I finally did it. I took one of those DNA tests." The room changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. My mother's coffee cup, which had been halfway to her mouth, completed its journey. My father's expression remained in place. The room looked exactly the same as it had looked 1 second earlier. But something in the air was different. Something had pressurized. I said, the ethnicity results were interesting. Different from what I expected. I paused. The relative matching was interesting too. My father said, "Oh, one word." The word itself was nothing. The delivery was everything. The particular flatness of a word produced by a person who is marshalling something. I said, there was a close match. Somebody the system thinks might be a parent or sibling. Somebody named Elena C. The White. That is the only way I know to describe what happened to their faces. Not a flinch, not a reaction, not an expression, a draining. The color left my mother's face the way water leaves a glass, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly. And by the time it was entirely gone. My father put his coffee cup down. He put it down with a care and precision that had nothing to do with not spilling coffee, and everything to do with needing something to do with his hands. My mother said, "Nadia." That was all, just my name. The way people say your name when they are about to say something that will change the shape of what your name means. I said, "Who is Elena C.?" Part 5. The silence before the answer. I want to tell you about the silence because the silence was its own event. It lasted. I did not time it, but it was long enough to understand that what was happening inside it was not confusion. It was not my parents processing a surprise. It was two people who had known a thing for 24 years deciding in real time that the moment they had been putting off had arrived and could not be put off further. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the table. The basketball hoop nobody had moved was visible through the kitchen window, dark in the March evening, patient in the way of things that have waited a long time in the same spot. My father said, "How accurate are those tests?" I said, "Accurate enough that I drove 2 hours on a Tuesday night." He nodded. He looked at his hands. He said, "We were going to tell you." My mother made a small sound. Not a word. The sound of someone who has heard a sentence begin in a way they cannot control. I said, "When?" He said, "We kept." There was never a right time. I said, "There were 24 years of time." He said, "I know." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made its periodic sound. The coffee was still warm. The pasta container from the restaurant in my city was still on the counter. I said, "Tell me now." Part 6. What they told me. My parents were 27 and 25 when they got married. They wanted children. Children did not come. Not in the first year. Not in the second. Not in the third. Tests happened. Findings arrived. The findings were, for my mother specifically, significant. My father's findings were also significant. The combination of their findings was, their doctor said, unlikely to resolve without intervention, and the interventions available in 1993 in Cleveland, Ohio, for a young couple of modest income who could not afford the most aggressive options, were limited. They had Seth in 1995 through a process I will describe the way my father described it, as involving a donor, a clinic, and a conversation they never had with anyone again. Seth knew this. He had been told when he was old enough to understand it, which they had determined to be 17. He had taken it, apparently, with the equanimity of a young man who was secure enough in his identity not to be destabilized by it. He had been asked not to say anything to me or Tommy. He had kept the confidence for 7 years. I had not known. I had spent 7 years sitting at a table with my brother who knew something fundamental about the shape of our family and had been asked to hold it. I thought about this for a moment and set it aside. Seth could be a conversation for later. My parents were still talking. Tommy, 2 years after Seth, had arrived by a different process, a pregnancy that surprised everyone, including the doctors, in the way that pregnancies sometimes surprise doctors who have given statistical assessments rather than categorical certainties. My mother was pregnant, and then my mother had Tommy, and the odds were revised in the way that odds are revised when they fail to account for the specific determination of particular people's biology. And then, 3 years after Tommy, they wanted another child. My mother was 32. The surprising pregnancy had not repeated itself. They were not in a position to afford the most expensive interventions. They were in a position, emotionally and practically, to expand their family in a different direction. They were in a position to adopt. The adoption was private, arranged through a facilitator, not an agency, a person who connected prospective parents with women in situations where they needed a placement for a child they could not raise. The process was, in 1998 in certain states, more informal than it is now. Documents were produced. Legalities were observed. And in April of 1998, a woman named Elena C., 22 years old, alone, in a situation she had not planned and could not navigate, placed a 3-day-old infant with a couple from Cleveland who had been waiting. The infant was me. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine while my father was still talking. I let her hand stay there. I was not ready to move away from it, and I was not ready to move toward it. I let it stay where it was, and I looked at the table and I listened. My father said, "We meant to tell you. The way we told Seth about the donor. We had a plan. We were going to tell you at 17. He paused. And then it was 17, and you were in a hard year. You were struggling with some things at school, and we didn't want to add to it. We said we'd wait. My mother said, and then it was never the right time. That sounds like an excuse. I said, it is an excuse. She said, yes. She did not remove her hand. I said, the joke. Silence. I said, the adoption joke. You made it for 20 years. My father made a sound that was not a word. My mother looked at the table. I said, did you think was it like a test? Did you think that if you said it and I didn't react, it meant I didn't need to know? My father said, no. At first it was thoughtless. We made the joke before we understood that you'd hear it so many times it would stick to you. And then it stuck. And it seemed almost protective, in a terrible way. If it was a joke, it couldn't be real. The joke was a way of saying the true thing without having to say the true thing. I looked at my father, the man who had sat at this table across from me for 24 years with the true thing in his chest and the joke in his mouth. I said, you said it in front of me, every holiday, for 20 years. He said, I know. I said, that's what's going to take me the longest to understand. He said, I know. Part 7. The night after I stayed the night. Not because the conversation was resolved. It was not resolved. It would not be resolved in one evening. It would be the work of many evenings and phone calls and sessions with a therapist who helped me understand the shape of what I was reorganizing. I stayed because driving 2 hours in the dark after the evening I'd had seemed like the wrong kind of alone, and my childhood bedroom still had my childhood bed in it, and sometimes a place you partly recognize is better than a place you fully know. I lay in my childhood bed, and I looked at the ceiling that I had looked at for 18 years, and I took an inventory. My name was still Nadia Voss. Nobody had taken that from me. The family I had grown up in was still my family. The pasta from the restaurant in my city was still in the container on the counter. The basketball hoop was still in the driveway. I was the daughter of two people who had wanted me so much they had found a specific process by which to bring me home and had then spent 24 years being too afraid to tell me, which is a version of love that is also a failure, which is, I was beginning to understand, what most love looks like up close. Somewhere, there was a woman named Elena C. who had taken a DNA test 2 years ago and uploaded her results and waited. who had named her account with a first name and a last initial and no photograph and no family tree, which was the equivalent of leaving a door slightly open. Not open enough to walk through uninvited, but open enough to be found by someone who was looking. She had been waiting to be found. I had found her. Not tonight. Not yet. But I had her name in the algorithm's assessment and the quiet fact of her waiting, and I was 24 years old with a question that had been in the room for 20 years and now had the beginning of an answer. I closed my eyes. The ceiling was the same ceiling. The house was the same house. I was the same person. Different and the same. Part 8. The calls I made. Pause here. If you have ever been the punchline of a joke that turned out to be the closest thing to the truth your family ever told, drop the word found in the comments. Because that's what this is. Being found by the truth you've been circling your whole life. I made 3 calls in the month after that Tuesday. The first was to Seth. I called him on a Saturday morning. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. I said, Mom and Dad told me. He said, I know. They called me. A pause. He said, I should have told you. I said, you were asked not to. He said, I know. I still should have. We talked for an hour. It was the longest conversation Seth and I had ever had, which says something about what secrets do to families. They don't just keep the secret, they keep the distances in place that make the secret possible. When the secret is out, the distances have to be renegotiated. We renegotiated, Seth and I, over an hour on a Saturday morning, in a conversation that started about the adoption and ended about something else entirely, about being siblings, about what we had been to each other through the joke years, about what we wanted to be now. It was the beginning of a different relationship. We are still building it. The second call was to Dr. Reyes, not the same Dr. Reyes as Simone, my own Dr. Reyes. Because it turns out that everyone in a story like this eventually finds their way to a careful person with a good chair and the quality of attention that makes you feel the room was built for what you're saying. I told her everything. She listened. She said, how do you feel about the people who raised you? I thought about it honestly. I said, I love them. And I'm angry at them. And I understand why they did what they did. And I don't think understanding excuses it. She said, that's 3 true things at the same time. I said, yes. She said, you can hold all 3. I said, I know, I'm going to need some practice. The third call was the hardest one. I sent a message through the DNA platform first. To the account. To Elena C. I wrote 4 sentences. I said, my name is Nadia. The test says we are a close match. I was adopted in 1998 in Cleveland. I am not sure what I'm looking for, but I wanted to reach out. She replied within an hour. She said, I know who you are. I have been hoping you would find me. I am ready to talk when you are. There is no rush. Take whatever time you need. I read her message 6 times. I waited 2 weeks. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned something in the previous month about the difference between the right time and the convenient time, and I wanted to make sure I was calling from the right time, and not just from the urgency of having waited long enough that moving felt easier than staying still. On a Tuesday evening, Tuesdays having become, in my life, the day when things shifted, I called. She answered on the second ring. She said, Nadia. My name in her voice. New and old at once, the way some things feel when they are both of those things simultaneously. I said, hi. She said, hi. We talked for 3 hours. Part 9. Elena. She was 48. She lived in Michigan. She had a family, a husband, 2 children who were teenagers, a life that had been built and lived and loved in the 24 years since she had placed a 3-day-old infant with a couple from Cleveland. She had thought about me every year on my birthday in April. She had taken the DNA test 2 years ago because her younger daughter had asked her to, casually, as a family history project, and she had uploaded the results and then done something she had not planned to do, which was create an account with her first name and last initial and leave it there, slightly open. She said, I didn't know if you knew. I didn't know if your parents had told you. I didn't want to. I didn't think it was mine to reach out without knowing if you knew. A pause. I thought if you were looking, you would find me. I thought if you weren't looking, you didn't need a stranger in your inbox. I said, I wasn't looking. Exactly. I was taking a joke seriously. She said, what joke? I told her about the adoption joke. The found you on the doorstep. The mailman's. The 20 years of it at dinner tables and holiday gatherings. She was quiet while I told her. When I finished, she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, oh, Nadia. The truth was right there the whole time. They just didn't know how to say it straight. I said, no, they didn't. She said, I'm sorry you heard it that way for so long. I said, I survived it. She said, you did more than survive it. You took it seriously when it counted. You drove 2 hours on a Tuesday. A pause. That's not survival. That's something else. I said, what is it? She thought for a moment. She said, knowing yourself well enough to take your own questions seriously. That's the thing. Most people talk themselves out of the questions before they get to the answers. I thought about 20 years of performing the laugh, the years of filing the question, the social media ad and the 4-week wait, and the 3 days of sitting with the results before I drove anywhere. I said, I almost talked myself out of it. She said, but you didn't. I said, no. She said, that's the whole story, I think. That you didn't. Epilogue. What the joke was fall. A Sunday. My apartment. The coffee I actually drink. At the table I chose. In the city I moved to when I was 22 and which is mine. In a way that no place before it has been mine. I am 26 now. 2 years since the Tuesday in March. 2 years since the faces turned white. I have met Elena in person 3 times. We meet in the middle, geographically and otherwise. A city between Cleveland and Michigan. A restaurant with good light. A lunch that has gone longer each time we've had it. We are figuring out what we are to each other, which is a project neither of us is rushing. She is warm and specific and has a sense of humor that is dry and arrives from unexpected directions, and which is, I have been told by more than one person, very similar to mine. My parents and I are in a different place than we were 2 years ago, not a resolved place, a more honest one. We have had the conversations that needed to be had, some of them more than once, and they have been hard in the way that necessary things are hard, and worth it in the way that necessary things are worth it. My mother no longer makes the adoption joke. My father has not made it in 2 years. Seth has not made it since the Saturday phone call, which I believe is permanent. Tommy, who was told the truth 2 months after I was, took it with an equanimity that surprised all of us, and then delivered a 40-minute meditation on family and identity at Thanksgiving that had everybody crying, which was the most emotion the Voss family had ever publicly produced, and which I found quietly magnificent. The joke is gone. In the space where it was, something more complicated and more accurate has been growing. Not a joke. Not a wound. A truth that we are all learning to carry out in the open instead of sideways and disguised. Here is what I know about the joke now. The joke was a door they didn't know how to open. The way they made it, repeated and casual and handed to all of us, so that I would learn to perform the response, was wrong. It was a failure of courage that lasted 20 years and cost something that I will continue to understand the shape of for years to come. But inside the joke, if you took it seriously, just once, just for a moment, just enough to drive 2 hours on a Tuesday and sit across from people whose faces could turn white. Inside the joke was the truest thing they ever said in front of me. The joke was always, she came from somewhere else. She was always someone we were lucky to have. She was never quite like us, which was never a problem, which was always the thing we didn't know how to say out loud. They just said it wrong. For 20 years, they said it as a laugh instead of as a love. I know what it was now. I'll take the love, even from the wrong direction, even sideways, even